For the love of God, would somebody just tell me something I don't already know? The voice of Flying Officer Hugo Vance was a sharp, brittle thing, thin and sharp-edged against the vast open gray of the Norfolk sky. It was a voice that had been polished by private schools and an expensive university, a voice accustomed to being obeyed, but the raw frustration leaking through its cracks was turning it shrill. He wasn't shouting, he was worse than shouting. He was speaking with the kind of strained, furious calm that precedes a thunderstorm. His perfectly coiffed hair, usually immaculate, had a single strand out of place, a detail that seemed to annoy him more than the multi-million-pound aircraft sitting inert in front of him. He stood with his hands on his hips, his posture a textbook imitation of a commander he'd once seen in a film. But the authority just wasn't there. He was a man playing a part, and the costume was a size too big. Before him, the Airbus A400M Atlas, callsign Titan III, was less an aircraft and more a monument to his failure. It was a colossal beast of a machine, its matte gray paint absorbing the weak afternoon light, making it look like a feature of the landscape, a man-made mountain on the flat expanse of RAF Marham. For 72 hours it had been a dead weight on the flight line. The air around it was thick with the smells of failure. The acrid tang of ozone from the overworked diagnostic equipment, the faint, ever-present scent of jet fuel, and the damp, earthy smell of rain-soaked concrete from the morning's drizzle. A biting wind, one that seemed to carry the loneliness of the North Sea, whipped across the airfield, making the half-dozen young technicians huddled by the open cargo ramp hunch their shoulders. They were good lads, the best the RAF had to offer, but Vance looked at their tired, grease-smudged faces and saw only incompetence. "Report," he snapped, his gaze falling on a young senior aircraftman who looked barely old enough to shave. The lad flinched. "No change, sir," the technician mumbled, his eyes fixed on the tablet in his hands. "We've run the primary and secondary avionics diagnostics for the 12th time. It's the same story. A phantom power drain somewhere in the forward bus. The system registers a catastrophic short, but there's no physical sign of one. We've checked every centimeter of wiring. There's nothing there. It's like a ghost, sir." Vance let out a sigh that was pure theater, a sound designed to be heard by everyone. "A ghost, aircraftman? We don't have ghosts at Royal Air Force Marham. We have procedure. We have manuals. What we seem to be lacking is basic engineering competence." The insult hung in the cold air, sharp and ugly. The technicians didn't react, their faces becoming blank, impassive masks. They'd learned that was the safest response to the flying officer's temper. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a crisis brewing in slow motion. Titan III was meant to be halfway to Estonia by now, carrying a highly classified suite of cyber warfare equipment, a critical component in a massive NATO exercise. Every hour it sat here, silent and brooding on the tarmac, was another excruciating turn of the screw for Vance. He could feel the eyes of the entire base on him, could practically hear the whispers in the mess hall. Most of all, he could feel the glacial stare of his commanding officer, Air Commodore Davies, even though she was a mile away in the command building. The pressure was immense, and it was forcing all his worst qualities to the surface. From the relative warmth of the maintenance hangar doorway, Warrant Officer Gavin McLeod watched the scene unfold, a chipped mug of tea warming his hands. He'd seen 100 young officers like Vance over his 30 years of service, full of confidence and theory, but as brittle as glass when faced with a problem the manual couldn't solve. McLeod was a lifer, a man whose hands were a roadmap of healed scars from countless engines and airframes. He knew this aircraft, not from a textbook, but from years of listening to its hums, its groans, its peculiar personality. He knew the technicians, too. He'd trained half of them. He knew they weren't incompetent, they were exhausted and stumped by a problem that defied modern logic. He took a slow sip of his tea, the sweet, milky brew a small comfort against the rising tension. He'd offered his own theory to Vance 2 days ago, a suggestion to check the old analog regulators that interfaced with the new glass cockpit, a place where digital and analog systems could clash. Vance had dismissed it with a wave of his hand. "We trust the diagnostics, warrant officer. We don't poke around with screwdrivers based on a hunch." McLeod sighed and watched as Vance began pacing, his polished boots crunching on the loose grit of the tarmac. The young officer was talking again, his voice rising in pitch. "This isn't just a drill, people. This is a time-sensitive deployment. The Air Commodore is going to want a head on a platter, and I assure you, it won't be mine." The threat was so blatant, so contrary to the ethos of good leadership, that McLeod felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. He was about to step out, to intervene, to gently suggest that the flying officer take a break before he destroyed his crew's morale completely. But he was interrupted by the crackle of Vance's radio. It was the main gate. "Saxon 0, this is Gate 1. Message for you. Over." Vance snatched the radio from his belt. "Go ahead, Gate 1. His voice was clipped, impatient. There was a slight hesitation on the other end. "Sir, we have a visitor for you, a Mr. Arthur Penhaligon. He says he's here about the Titan." The security guard's voice was filled with confusion. Vance froze mid-pace. Penhaligon. He didn't know any Penhaligon. He hadn't requested any external consultants. The only instruction he'd received from the Air Commodore's office was a cryptic, last-minute addendum to his orders. "A specialist will be attending. Afford him your full cooperation." Vance had been expecting a team from Airbus, a corporate hotshot with a briefcase and a laptop, not a mister. He looked from the deadweight aircraft to the weary faces of his crew, and a fresh wave of anger washed over him. He felt undermined, confused. The last thing he needed was some civilian wandering onto his flight line to offer their 2 pennies worth. "A civilian?" He barked into the radio, his voice dripping with contempt. "On whose authority? Send him away, I don't have time for this." "Sir," the gate guard replied, his voice now even more uncertain. "The authority is from the base commander's office. The instruction says he is to be given unrestricted access." The words hung in the air, a direct contradiction to Vance's command. In the background, McLeod lowered his teacup, a strange, thoughtful expression slowly spreading across his weathered face. The frustration on the flight line was about to curdle into something else entirely. Something new was coming. 10 minutes later, a vehicle appeared, crawling along the perimeter road with a slowness that seemed almost defiant. It wasn't a sleek RAF staff car or a rugged service Land Rover. It was a dark green 20-year-old Rover, a car from a forgotten era of British motoring, its paintwork clean but faded. It pulled to a stop a respectful distance from the aircraft, and for a moment, nothing happened. Flying Officer Vance stood with his arms crossed, a posture of pure impatience, his foot tapping a silent, furious rhythm on the concrete. The wind tugged at his uniform, but he seemed not to notice the cold. All his focus was on the civilian car that was trespassing in his world. The driver's side door opened with a faint, metallic groan, and a man emerged. Vance's expression of annoyance deepened into one of open disbelief. He had been expecting a corporate engineer, someone in a sharp suit with a look of brisk efficiency. The man unfolding himself from the old car was anything but. He was old, perhaps 80 or more, with a slight stoop to his shoulders that spoke of a long life. He wore worn corduroy trousers, scuffed brown shoes, and a tweed jacket with leather patches at the elbows, the kind of garment you'd find in a countryside charity shop. His hair was a wisp of fine gray, combed neatly across a balding scalp, and his face was a gentle landscape of wrinkles. He looked, to Vance's eye, like a retired history teacher who'd taken a wrong turn on his way to a village tea room. This was the specialist? This was the man the Air Commodore had granted unrestricted access? It had to be a joke, a wind-up. The old man closed the car door with a quiet click and began to walk towards them. He didn't hurry. his pace unbothered by the biting wind or the palpable tension radiating from the knot of uniformed men. He carried no briefcase, no laptop, no diagnostic tools of any kind. His hands were empty, shoved into the pockets of his jacket. As he drew closer, Vance strode forward to intercept him, his movements sharp and aggressive, a guard dog moving to challenge an intruder. "That's far enough," Vance called out, his voice carrying the full weight of his rank. "I am Flying Officer Vance. I'm in command of this flight line. Who are you?" The old man stopped. He looked past Vance, his gaze settling on the enormous, silent shape of the A400M. There was no surprise in his eyes, no awe at the sight of the advanced military aircraft. He looked at it with a strange familiarity, a deep and knowing sadness, as if he were looking at a magnificent horse that had gone lame. "Her name," the old man said, his voice quiet but resonant, a low burr with a hint of a West Country accent, "is Titan III. He said it not as a question, but as a statement of fact, a simple acknowledgement. Vance was taken aback for a second. The designation wasn't classified, but it wasn't common knowledge for civilians either. He recovered quickly. "I don't care if you know its pet name. This is a restricted area. I was told to expect a specialist." The contempt in his voice was thick enough to taste. He let his eyes wander over the old man's worn clothes, a dismissive head-to-toe appraisal. "You, I'm guessing, are not it." The old man finally turned his eyes from the plane and looked at Vance. They were pale blue, surprisingly clear and sharp, and they held the young officer's gaze without a flicker of intimidation. "The name's Arthur Penhaligon," he said calmly, "and I was told she was in a spot of bother." He then did something that completely broke the protocol of the confrontation. He simply walked around the fuming flying officer as if he were a lamppost, and continued his slow, deliberate path toward the aircraft. From the hangar door, Warrant Officer McLeod watched, his mug of tea now forgotten in his hand. He saw the exchange, saw the sublime, almost comical ignorance of Vance's arrogance. But he also saw something else. He saw the way Penhaligon moved. He saw the way the old man's eyes weren't just looking at the plane, but were scanning it, tracing the lines of the fuselage, the seams of the access panels, the heavy-duty actuators on the flaps. It was the look of a man who wasn't seeing a machine, but was reading a story. Vance, his face now a mask of crimson fury at being so casually dismissed, hurried after him. "Did you not hear me? I am giving you a direct order to halt. You are a security risk. You will present me with identification and state your purpose, or my men will escort you from this base." He was standing directly in front of Penhaligon now, blocking his path, his body rigid with indignation. A small audience of technicians had gathered, their work forgotten, drawn by the unfolding drama. They stood in silence, watching their insufferable superior berate a pensioner. It was, at the very least, a distraction from their own fruitless work. Mr. Penhaligon stopped again, his gaze still fixed on the nose of the giant aircraft. He reached up one of his hands, weathered and knotted with age, the nails short and clean, and rested it gently against the cool metal skin of the fuselage just below the cockpit window. The gesture was so tender, so paternal, it was almost shocking. "It's not in the bus," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "They're all looking in the bus. But the problem isn't there, is it, old girl?" Vance let out a short, incredulous bark of a laugh. "Oh, you've cracked it, have you? Just by patting the nose? The combined expertise of 3 maintenance shifts, a dozen avionics specialists, and a direct consultation with the manufacturer couldn't find it, but you've solved it with a magic touch." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. "Listen to me, old man. I don't know what game the Air Commodore is playing, but it ends now. You're a civilian trespasser. I want to see your base access credentials and a letter of authorization right now, or I'm calling the service police." Slowly, deliberately, Mr. Penhaligon lowered his hand from the plane. He turned his head and looked squarely at Flying Officer Hugo Vance. The wind whipped a few strands of gray hair across his forehead. He didn't seem angry, or frightened, or even annoyed. He simply seemed patient, as if he were waiting for a small, predictable storm to blow itself out. Without a word, he reached into the inner pocket of his tweed jacket. The small crowd of onlookers held their breath. Warrant Officer McLeod took an involuntary step forward from the hangar, his eyes narrowed, trying to see, trying to understand the strange, inexplicable feeling that he was on the cusp of witnessing something truly important. Mr. Penhaligon's movements were unhurried. The hand that emerged from his tweed jacket held a simple, worn leather wallet, softened and darkened by decades of use, its corners smooth with age. It was the kind of wallet a man buys once in his life and keeps forever. With a slow deliberation that seemed calculated to infuriate the impatient officer in front of him, he opened it and extracted a single, laminated card. It wasn't a military ID or a government credential. It was a National Express bus pass for senior citizens. He held it out to Vance. For a moment, Flying Officer Vance just stared at the card, his mind unable to process the sheer, mundane absurdity of it. Then he snatched it from Penhaligon's hand. "Arthur Penhaligon," he read aloud, his voice dripping with a corrosive sarcasm that made even his own technicians wince. "Date of birth 1944. Well, Mr. Penhaligon, this might get you a discounted fare to Skegness, but it does not grant you access to a secure RAF flight line. It does not grant you the right to so much as breathe on my aircraft." He held the pass up between his thumb and forefinger, as if it were a soiled piece of rubbish. "I'm not sure what kind of senile fantasy you're living out, but it's over. This is your final chance to turn around and walk back to that rust bucket you drove in, or I will have you forcibly removed and detained for trespassing on Ministry of Defense property. Do you understand me?" The old man made no move to take his bus pass back. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on Vance's, his expression one of placid neutrality. It was this calmness, this utter refusal to be provoked, that was truly beginning to unnerve the young officer. It was like shouting at a granite cliff face. The insult simply vanished without leaving a mark. Vance's face, already flushed with anger, darkened to a dangerous shade of purple. His professionalism, already a thin veneer, was cracking apart. "Right," he seethed, pulling his personal radio from his belt. "That's it. You've had your chance." His thumb moved to the transmit button. But from the hangar, Warrant Officer McLeod wasn't looking at the bus pass. He wasn't even really listening to Vance's tirade. He had seen it all before. His gaze was fixed on something else, a tiny detail that Vance's fury had rendered him completely blind to. As Mr. Penhaligon had reached into his jacket, the tweed lapel had folded over slightly in the wind. And there, pinned just below the buttonhole, was a small, discreet piece of metal. It wasn't shiny. It was a dull, pewter grey color, barely noticeable against the mottled brown of the fabric. It was a bird. A small raptor, maybe an inch long, captured in a steep, powerful dive, its wings swept back, its form a study in aerodynamic perfection. For a fleeting, disorienting second, the scene on the tarmac at RAF Marham dissolved in McLeod's mind. The oppressive grey sky of Norfolk was replaced by the damp chill of a makeshift hangar in West Germany. The year was 1988, and he was a fresh-faced junior technician, barely 19 years old, listening to the legendary, almost mythical stories told by the old hands, the veterans of a war he had been too young for. He could almost smell the oil and damp canvas, hear the low voice of his first mentor, a grizzled old chief technician named Davies, a man who had been a flight engineer on the Vulcan bombers. Davies had been talking about the Falklands War, about the mad, desperate scramble to keep the aircraft flying in the most hostile conditions imaginable. He told them a story, one that was never written in any official history. He spoke of a small, unofficial unit of engineers, a ghost crew drawn from the best of the best.
They weren't a squadron. They were a collection of so-called miracle workers who could fix anything. They rebuilt engines on windswept runways,
rewired entire avionics bays using scavenged parts from shot-up airframes, and kept the Harriers and Vulcans in the air through what the pilots called sheer bloody witchcraft. Davies had lowered his voice, a conspiratorial whisper. They didn't have a name, not an official one, he'd said, but they had a token, a little pin they had made themselves. A kestrel, for the bird of prey that can hover in a gale, that sees the smallest detail from 1,000 feet up. They said the man who started it, their quiet leader, they just called him the Kestrel. He could listen to an engine for 10 seconds and tell you which bearing was about to fail. MacLeod remembered asking what happened to them, to the man they called the Kestrel. The old chief technician had just shrugged. They vanished, faded back into the service when the war was over. Most are gone now, and you'll never see one of those pins. They're rarer than a medal. The men who earned them, they were a different breed. They didn't talk. They just did. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving MacLeod standing in the cold Norfolk air, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs. He looked at the small, dull pin on the old man's lapel. A kestrel in a stooping dive. He looked at the old man's calm, patient eyes, the weathered hands that had rested so knowingly on the skin of the aircraft. He looked at his date of birth on the bus pass Vance was still clutching. 1944. He would have been 38 during the Falklands War. The perfect age for a seasoned, genius engineer at the peak of his powers. It couldn't be. It was a myth, a hangar story. And yet, he watched as Vance's thumb pressed down on the transmit button. "Security control, this is Saxon 0. "Sir," MacLeod's voice cut through the air. It wasn't loud, but it had the unmistakable ring of authority that came from 30 years of service. A sound that made every technician on the flight line instinctively straighten up. "Sir, I would strongly advise against that." He took a deliberate step out from the shelter of the hangar and began to walk towards them, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on the flying officer. The standoff had just entered a new and far more dangerous phase. The silence that followed Warrant Officer MacLeod's words was more profound than the roar of any jet engine. It was a vacuum, a sudden absence of sound that seemed to draw all the air from the flight line. The technicians who had been watching the drama with a kind of detached amusement now stood frozen, their faces etched with disbelief. An enlisted man, even a warrant officer of MacLeod's seniority, did not publicly countermand a direct action from a commissioned officer. It was not done. It was the military equivalent of questioning the laws of physics. Flying Officer Vance's face, which had been a mask of purple rage, went completely white. The shock was so profound it momentarily eclipsed his anger. He slowly lowered the radio, his mouth opening and closing silently for a moment before he found his voice. "Warrant Officer," he said, his voice a low, trembling whisper of fury. "I suggest you retract that statement. Stands down. And return to the hangar before you turn a career-long list of commendations into a one-way ticket to a court-martial." MacLeod didn't flinch. He continued his steady walk until he was standing just a few feet away, planting himself squarely between his superior officer and the quiet old man. The difference between the two uniformed men was stark. Vance was all sharp angles and brittle energy, a man vibrating with indignation. MacLeod was like a block of granite, immovable and solid, his authority radiating not from the rank on his sleeve, but from the sheer, undeniable weight of his 30 years of service. "I can't do that, sir," he said, his voice dangerously calm. He looked past Vance's shoulder at the man with the kestrel pin. "This man is a guest of the Air Commodore." "I believe there has been a serious misunderstanding as to the nature of his visit." "A misunderstanding?" Vance's laugh was a high, unhinged sound. The man has a bus pass, McLeod. A bus pass. I am in command here, and I have made a lawful decision based on a clear security threat. You are now obstructing an officer in the execution of his duty. This is your final warning. This was it. The precipice. McLeod could feel the stares of the young technicians on his back. He could see the career he had painstakingly built over 3 decades crumbling to dust. He was risking his pension, his reputation, his entire way of life, all based on a half-remembered hangar story and a gut feeling. But as he looked at Mr. Penhaligon's calm, knowing eyes, a strange certainty settled over him. He knew, with a conviction that went deeper than logic, that he was on the right side of this. In a move of calculated, breathtaking insubordination, he turned his back on the fuming flying officer and addressed the old man directly, his tone shifting from confrontational to one of deep, almost reverential respect. "Mr. Penhaligon," McLeod said, his voice now quiet and deferential. "I'm Warrant Officer Gavin McLeod. A sincere apology for the reception you've received. It will be rectified." He then reached into his own pocket and, ignoring the sputtering rage of F.O. Vance, pulled out not a service radio, but his personal mobile phone. He swiped the screen and found a number in his contacts. It was a direct line to the Air Commodore's personal assistant, a ferociously efficient flight lieutenant he'd known for years. A call like this, from his personal phone on an open flight line, about a command-level issue, was a breach of a dozen different protocols. He didn't care. He pressed the call button. "Flight Lieutenant Davies, please," he said, when a voice answered. After a brief pause, a sharp, familiar voice came on the line. "McLeod, what is it?" "The AOC is in a briefing." He lowered his voice, turning slightly to shield the phone from the wind. His heart was pounding, but his words were steady and precise. "Ma'am, it's McLeod, down on the Titan III flight line. Apologies for the channel, but this is a matter of some urgency." He paused, choosing his next words with extreme care. "The specialist has arrived." "Yes, ma'am. The situation is delicate. It seems Flying Officer Vance wasn't fully read in on the guest's historical significance. He let that hang in the air, offering a ladder for the command staff to climb down. A way to frame this as a briefing failure rather than a junior officer's catastrophic arrogance. He continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Ma'am, I need you to look at the name again. Penhaligon. Arthur Penhaligon. And I need you to ask the Air Commodore one question, and one question only." He took a breath. "Does she know the significance of a kestrel pin?" The silence on the other end of the line was immediate and absolute. For a moment, McLeod thought the connection had been lost. He could hear the faint, distant sound of papers shuffling, then a sharp, muffled exclamation away from the receiver. When the PA's voice returned, it was completely different. The brisk efficiency was gone, replaced by a tone of pure, unadulterated urgency that made the hairs on McLeod's arms stand up. "Warrant Officer," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "Listen to me very carefully. Do not, under any circumstances, let that man leave the base. I repeat, anchor him to that spot if you have to. The Air Commodore is on her way. Now." The line went dead. McLeod slowly lowered the phone, a single bead of cold sweat tracing a path down his temple. He had thrown the grenade. Now he had to wait for the explosion. He turned to face F.O. Vance, whose face was now a grotesque mask of confusion and rage. "You have lost your mind, McLeod," Vance whispered, his voice trembling. "Calling the AOC's office about a pin. I will personally see to it that you are stripped of your rank. You are finished. Do you hear me? Finished." McLeod met his furious gaze without wavering. He felt a strange sense of calm descend over him. He had placed his bet. Now all he could do was wait for the wheel to stop spinning. "No, sir," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The Air Commodore is on her way down. He gestured with his head towards the silent A400M. All we have to do now is wait. The minutes that followed stretched into an eternity. The flight line, usually a place of purposeful noise and activity, was now wrapped in a heavy, awkward silence, punctuated only by the mournful cry of the Norfolk wind and the distant, cutting scream of an F-35 Lightning rocketing into the sky. Flying Officer Vance paced back and forth in a tight, 10-foot line, a caged tiger radiating a furious, impotent energy. He refused to look at either McLeod or the old man, his jaw set so tightly it looked like it might crack. The young technicians, caught in the crossfire, busied themselves with meaningless tasks, checking gauges they'd already checked, coiling cables that were already tidy, all while stealing nervous glances at the three figures at the center of the unfolding crisis. They spoke in hushed whispers, the question hanging unspoken in the air. Had the warrant officer finally lost his mind? It was the young senior aircraftman, a lad named Reese whom Vance had berated earlier, who finally broke the spell. He wiped his greasy hands on a rag and, with a courage born of pure confusion, cautiously approached the warrant officer. "W.O.," he murmured, keeping his voice low. "What's happening? Who is—" He trailed off, gesturing with his head towards the still, silent figure of Mr. Penhaligon. McLeod looked down at the young technician's worried face and saw a genuine need to understand. He gave a slight nod. "Walk with me, Reese." He led the young man a few paces away, towards an open maintenance panel on the aircraft's fuselage, creating the illusion of a work-related conversation. "Pretend we're checking the hydraulic fluid levels," he said out of the corner of his mouth. Reese dutifully peered at the gauges. "Sir," he whispered, "the FO is going to have you crucified. What did you mean about a pin?" McLeod didn't answer straight away. He stared into the complex guts of the aircraft, his mind casting back through the decades. "When I was your age," he began, his voice a low rumble, "the Air Force was a different world. We had jets that were 50 years old flying alongside brand new ones. There was less software, more soul, I suppose. More things that could be fixed with a wrench and a bit of know-how. The men who taught me were a different breed. They'd worked on Vulcans and Lightnings, aircraft that would kill you if you didn't give them the proper respect." He paused, then looked over at Mr. Penhaligon, who had now placed his other hand on the aircraft, standing with his head bowed slightly as if in prayer. "They used to tell stories. Hangar myths, you'd call them. Stories about guys with a gift, a knack." He turned his gaze back to Reese, his eyes serious. "The Falklands War. You've read the books, seen the documentaries, but you've no idea what it was really like. They were keeping aircraft flying in the middle of the South Atlantic, with hurricane-force winds and salt spray that could corrode metal in a week. They had no spares, no proper hangars. They were performing miracles every single day just to keep the Harriers in the air. And the stories said there was one man, an engineer, who was better than anyone. They said he was a ghost." McLeod leaned a little closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "They called him the Kestrel, because he could see things no one else could. He could spot a hairline fracture on a turbine blade from 20 feet away. The pilots said he had X-ray eyes. They told a story." He let out a soft, incredulous chuckle. "They said he could put a tin mug of tea on the wing of a running Harrier, right over the engine housing. And just by watching the ripples on the surface of the tea, he could tell you if the engine's vibrations were off. He could tell you if the bearings were a fraction of a millimeter out of alignment. He didn't need diagnostics. He could feel the machine. He could listen to it." SAC Reese stared at him, his mouth slightly agape. That's not possible." "Isn't it?" McLeod murmured. "This man and his team, they had their own little badge of honor, something they made themselves. A small pewter pin. A kestrel in a dive." He looked pointedly at Mr. Penhaligon's tweed lapel, and Reese's eyes followed his. The young technician's eyes widened, a look of dawning, slack-jawed comprehension spreading across his face. He looked from the small pin to the old man, and then back to McLeod. "You're saying I'm saying," McLeod said softly, "that Flying Officer Vance has just spent the last 20 minutes threatening to arrest a living legend. A man who forgot more about keeping aircraft flying before you were born than Vance will ever learn." As the weight of McLeod's words settled, a profound awe began to replace the fear and confusion on Reese's face. He looked over at Mr. Penhaligon again. He no longer saw a frail, lost pensioner. He saw a man of immense, hidden power. He saw the ghost from the story standing right there on their flight line, his hands resting on their broken aircraft, listening for a secret that only he could hear. It was at that exact moment that a new sound cut through the wind. It was faint at first, but growing rapidly. Not the high-pitched wail of a siren, but the deep, throaty rumble of a powerful engine, moving with a speed and purpose that was utterly unmistakable. It was the sound of command. McLeod straightened up, his face grim. "Showtime, son," he muttered. Every head on the flight line turned towards the perimeter road. The waiting was over. The storm had arrived. The black Jaguar XF, the Air Commodore's official staff car, didn't slow down as it approached. It simply arrived. It swept onto the flight line with the silent, predatory grace of its namesake, its tires barely whispering on the concrete before coming to a perfect, precise halt 20 yards from the aircraft. The engine cut out, and in the ensuing silence, a new kind of tension descended, sharper and colder than before. This was no longer a squabble. It was a reckoning. The rear door was opened from the inside before the driver could even make a move. Air Commodore Josephine Davies emerged in a single fluid motion. She was a woman who seemed to be carved from the same lean, functional materials as the fighter jets she commanded. In her late 40s, her dark hair was tied back in a severe regulation bun, and her face, sharp and intelligent, was devoid of makeup. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture ramrod straight, but she moved with the coiled, economic energy of an athlete. She was the very picture of the modern Royal Air Force, professional, formidable, and radiating an aura of absolute, unshakable command. Flying Officer Hugo Vance saw her and snapped to attention, his back so straight it looked painful. This was his moment to salvage the situation, to frame the narrative. He took 2 quick, decisive steps forward to meet her, his salute a sharp, desperate crack of motion. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice a fraction too loud. "Flying Officer Vance, the situation is under control. We have a civilian trespasser on the flight line who has been acting erratically. I was in the process of having him removed as per security protocol." He was trying to sound decisive, in command, but a nervous tremor in his voice betrayed him. Air Commodore Davies did not slow down. She did not acknowledge his salute. She did not even turn her head. She walked straight past him as if he were a ghost, a statue, a meaningless feature of the landscape. Her eyes, a cool, piercing gray, were fixed on one person and one person only. The public dismissal was so absolute, so devastatingly complete, that a collective, silent gasp seemed to pass through the assembled technicians. Vance was left standing there, his hand frozen in a salute to empty air, his face instantly turning from pale to a deep, mortified crimson. He had been erased. The entire flight line held its breath. Warrant Officer McLeod felt a quiet, profound sense of vindication settle in his chest. SAC Reese, standing beside him, simply stared, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. They were watching something that would be talked about in hushed tones in the mess halls and hangars of RAF Marham for years to come. The Air Commodore came to a stop a foot away from Mr. Penhaligon. She didn't tower over him, but her presence was immense. The old man in his worn tweed jacket and the high-ranking officer in her perfectly pressed uniform stood facing each other, 2 figures from entirely different worlds. Then, in a move that sent a shockwave of pure disbelief through every single person watching, Air Commodore Josephine Davies, a woman who commanded a base of thousands and was responsible for billions of pounds worth of military assets, drew herself up to her full height. She extended her hand. "Mr. Penhaligon," she said, and her voice, clear and crisp, rang out across the concrete with a tone of profound and unmistakable respect that bordered on reverence. "Air Commodore Davies, it is an absolute honor to have you on my airfield, sir." Sir. The word dropped into the silence like a depth charge. An Air Commodore does not call a civilian sir, not unless that civilian is the king or a visiting head of state. It was a complete seismic inversion of the natural order, a tear in the very fabric of military protocol. Vance flinched as if he'd been physically struck. The bus pass, which he was still clutching in his hand, suddenly felt like a piece of burning coal. Mr. Penhaligon finally took his hand from the fuselage of the silent aircraft. A warm, genuine smile crinkled the corners of his pale blue eyes, the first real expression he had shown all day. He took the Air Commodore's offered hand in his own weathered one. "Josephine," he said, his quiet voice filled with an unmistakable fondness. "Goodness me. Last time I saw you, you were a flight lieutenant with a smudge of hydraulic fluid on your nose, trying to figure out why a tornado's air brakes wouldn't deploy." A rare, genuine smile touched the Air Commodore's lips. "You told me to check the micro switch in the throttle block. You said they always corroded in the sea air. You were right. A good engineer always trusts the basics," Penhaligon said gently, releasing her hand. "You've done well for yourself, lass. Very well." The exchange, so personal and filled with shared history, only deepened the mystery and the shock. This wasn't just a living legend. This was her mentor. The quiet giant on whose shoulders her own career had been built. The full, crushing weight of what he had done finally crashed down upon Hugo Vance. He wasn't just standing on a landmine. He was in the center of the blast crater, and the earth had already been vaporized beneath his feet. He looked from the warm, respectful expression on his commanding officer's face to the calm, unassuming old man, and for the first time he didn't see a doddery old pensioner. He saw the legend. He saw the Kestrel. The Air Commodore's brief smile vanished as she turned her attention to the A400M. "They tell me she's not talking," she said to Penhaligon, her tone shifting back to professional concern. "She's talking," Penhaligon replied softly, patting the aircraft's nose again. "It's just that nobody here speaks her language anymore. It's a faint whisper. You have to be listening very carefully to hear it." Davies nodded, her trust in his assessment absolute. "Then I shall leave you to it. You have my full authority. Whatever you need, it's yours." She paused. Then her head turned, and her cool grey gaze finally, deliberately, fell upon the frozen figure of Flying Officer Vance. The warmth was gone, replaced by a glacial fury, a cold, controlled rage that made the afternoon air feel like ice. She took a slow, deliberate step towards him. "Flying Officer Vance," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Remain exactly where you are. You and I are going to have a conversation about respect." Air Commodore Davies's voice was deceptively soft, yet it cut through the air with the precision of a scalpel. She took another step, closing the distance to the disgraced flying officer until she was standing directly in front of him. She held his gaze for a long, silent moment, letting the full weight of his failure suffocate him before she spoke. "A conversation about respect, Flying Officer," she repeated, her voice a low, controlled current of icy rage. She reached out and, with 2 fingers, delicately took the senior citizen's bus pass from his numb, unresisting hand. She held it up. "You see this?" she asked, her voice still quiet, yet carrying to every corner of the silent flight line. "This isn't a security threat. This is a life.
a life spent in service to the same Air Force that granted you the privilege of wearing that uniform. A privilege, it appears, you have profoundly misunderstood. She didn't just speak to Vance. She turned her head slightly, addressing the entire assembled crew of young technicians, her voice rising in volume and intensity. Her words were no longer a reprimand. They were a lesson, burned into the memory of everyone present. "You think this is about manuals and diagnostics?" she boomed, her voice now ringing with the authority of command. "You think your rank gives you knowledge?"
Let me tell you who this man is. Let me tell you about a name you won't find in any official history, but a name that is etched into the soul of this service. She turned and gestured with the bus pass towards the quiet old man. This is Arthur Penhaligon. In 1982, during the Falklands War, a Sea Harrier, call sign Charity 2, took multiple hits from ground fire over Goose Green. By some miracle, the pilot got it back to the fleet, landing on a carrier deck with its entire navigation suite fried, its fuselage riddled with holes, and fuel gushing from a ruptured line. The evacuation order had been given. The ship was at battle stations, but the pilot was trapped, wounded, in a cockpit canopy that wouldn't open. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. While officers were running for cover, a 38-year-old chief technician named Arthur Penhaligon refused a direct order to abandon the flight deck. Under the threat of incoming air attack, he spent 17 minutes rewiring the canopy's emergency release by hand. Using a roll of copper wire he stripped from a damaged radio set. He got the canopy open. He got that pilot out seconds before the aircraft was doused in firefighting foam. She took a step closer to Vance, her eyes blazing. He was put forward for the George Cross. He refused it. He was offered a field commission to become an officer, like you. He refused that, too. He said, and I quote, "The work is the only reward I need. Men like him are the reason men like you have an Air Force to serve in. They are the giants whose shoulders you stand on." She turned her burning gaze back to the now ashen-faced Vance. "This man is not a trespasser, flying officer. He is a national treasure. And you were about to have him arrested because you couldn't see past his age and his jacket. You saw a problem with your authority, not a solution to your problem." The words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow to Vance's career and his pride. He could only stand there, his face a mask of abject horror, as the full, crushing weight of his arrogance came crashing down upon him. The Air Commodore's voice dropped back to an icy whisper. "Report to my office at 0800 hours tomorrow. My adjutant will meet you. Now get out of my sight." Vance didn't need to be told twice. He didn't salute. He couldn't. He simply turned, a broken man, and walked away. The sound of his own footsteps on the tarmac, the only sound in a world that had crumbled around him. As Vance retreated, the Air Commodore's entire demeanor shifted. The icy fury vanished, replaced by a warm, professional calm, as she turned back to the quiet hero of her story. "Arthur," she said, "I apologize for the reception." Mr. Penhaligon simply shook his head, a gesture that dismissed the need for any apology or retribution. "The lad is just green, Josephine," he said, his voice calm, "full of book smarts and empty of wisdom. He'll either learn from this or he won't. That's up to him." He then turned his gaze back to the A400M, his focus absolute. "Right. The old girl's been waiting long enough. Let's get to work." His eyes scanned the assembled technicians, who were now staring at him with a look of pure, unadulterated awe. "I'm going to need a few things," he announced. "A full toolkit, an old Fluke analog multimeter, not one of these new digital toys. A 50-foot spool of copper wire, a jeweler's magnifying glass, and a proper cup of tea. 2 sugars. As a stunned Warrant Officer McLeod hurried to relay the orders, Mr. Penhaligon walked towards the open ramp of the aircraft. He paused and looked at the awestruck faces of McLeod and young Reese. "Come on then, you two," he said with a slight twinkle in his eye. "A good engineer never works alone. It's time for a lesson." He led them into the dark, cavernous interior of the aircraft, into the cramped avionics bay behind the cockpit. a claustrophobic maze of wires and black boxes. The air was cool and smelled of ozone and insulated plastic. Penhaligon didn't switch on the harsh overhead strip lights. Instead, he took a small, low-powered torch from McLeod and began to sweep its gentle beam slowly across the racks. His movements patient and methodical. He wasn't just looking, he was observing, smelling the air, occasionally touching a thick loom of wires as if taking its pulse. After several minutes of intense silence, he stopped. He focused the beam on a spot deep within the machine's guts, almost completely obscured by a main power conduit. "There," he whispered, "just as I thought." He beckoned Reese closer. "Bring your eyes here, son." Reese squeezed in, looking where the old man pointed. He could see nothing but a tiny, insignificant-looking connector, no bigger than his thumbnail, joining two thin wires. "What do you see?" Penhaligon asked. "Nothing, sir," Reese admitted. "Just a standard connector." "Exactly," Penhaligon said. "You're looking, but you're not seeing. Look at the color. A tiny bit of green, like verdigris, right at the join." He handed Reese the magnifying glass. "Now look." Reese held the glass up, his hand trembling slightly. Under magnification, he could see it. A minuscule, almost invisible dusting of corrosion, a cancerous growth on the pristine connection. "Galvanic corrosion," Penhaligon explained, his voice the calm, steady tone of a master craftsman. The manufacturer used a brass pin in an aluminium housing, two different metals. Over the years, with a bit of moisture and salt in the Norfolk air, they've turned into a tiny battery. It doesn't create a short circuit, it just leeches. A quiet little vampire, drinking a few milliamps of power, creating a phantom fault that disappears the moment you test the circuit directly. Your digital diagnostics are too clever for their own good. They're looking for a dead body, not a slow, quiet bleed. I last saw this on a Harrier that had spent a month getting soaked in sea spray in the South Atlantic back in '82. He patted the avionics rack gently. The old girl was whispering. You just had to be quiet enough to hear her. He then looked at Reese, handing him a wire cutter and a fresh connector from the toolkit. "Now, son," he said, "let's bring her back to life." The fix itself was an anticlimax of beautiful simplicity. A careful snip of two wires, the removal of the tiny corroded connector that had humbled a machine worth £250 million, and the fitting of a new one, its gold-plated contacts gleaming in the torchlight. SAC Reese, under the quiet, steady guidance of the master, performed the work with the focus and reverence of a surgeon. When he was done, Mr. Penhaligon simply said, "Right, try her now." Warrant Officer McLeod relayed the order to the cockpit. A moment of pregnant silence, and then the avionics bay was flooded with the soft, green glow of a dozen screens flickering to life. A low, powerful hum replaced the dead silence, the sound of the aircraft's soul returning to its body. A ragged, spontaneous cheer erupted from the technicians gathered at the ramp. Titan III was alive. Mr. Penhaligon allowed himself a small, satisfied nod. He accepted the now lukewarm cup of tea he'd been promised, drank it while politely deflecting the effusive, grateful praise of the flight crew, and offered a final piece of advice to a wide-eyed Reese. "Trust your senses as much as you trust your sensors, son. An old machine will tell you its secrets if you know how to listen." Then, with a simple handshake from McLeod and a nod to the others, he was gone, his old green Rover disappearing down the perimeter road as quietly as it had arrived. He left behind a fully functional aircraft and a flight line of men who knew they had just witnessed a legend. 3 weeks later, the smoky, comforting fug of a countryside pub, the Kestrel's Arms, a coincidence that was not lost on him, was a world away from the wind-swept tarmac of RAF Marham. Hugo Vance, formerly Flying Officer Vance, sat alone at a small, sticky table in the darkest corner of the room. He was in civilian clothes, a shapeless gray jumper and worn jeans that made him look younger and somehow smaller, stripped of the armor and authority of his uniform. He nursed a pint of bitter, watching the foam slowly collapse. His reckoning had been swift and surgically precise. The Air Commodore hadn't shouted. She had simply laid out his failure in cold, logical terms, like an accident report. It wasn't his mistake that had cost him his career. It was his arrogance, his refusal to listen. He hadn't been dismissed from the service. That would have been too noisy, too dramatic. Instead, he had been reassigned. A logistics desk at a supply depot in the Outer Hebrides. A quiet, gray purgatory where he would count spare parts in triplicate for the rest of his service. It was a career graveyard, and he knew he had dug the grave himself. The pub door opened, letting in a gust of damp autumnal air, and two familiar figures. Warrant Officer McLeod and Mr. Penhaligon walked in, laughing about something. They looked for all the world like two old friends meeting for their weekly pint. Vance's first instinct was to shrink, to make himself invisible, to sink through the floorboards. The shame was a physical thing, a hot flush that spread across his neck. He hunched over his drink, praying they wouldn't see him. But of course they did. As McLeod went to the bar, Penhaligon's gaze swept the room and his eyes met Vance's. There was no triumph in the old man's expression, no hint of a gloat. There was just a quiet, calm acknowledgement. Vance quickly looked down into his beer, his heart hammering. He waited for the inevitable, the cold shoulder, the muttered insult, the public shaming he so richly deserved. A minute later, a shadow fell over his table. He looked up to see Mr. Penhaligon standing there. In his hand, he held a freshly poured pint of ale, its head a perfect, creamy dome. He placed it on the table in front of Vance. "It's a bitter pill to swallow, son." "Pride," the old man said, his voice as gentle as it had been on the flight line. Vance was speechless. He could only stammer, the words catching in his throat. "Mr. Penhaligon, I don't know what to say. I am so deeply sorry for my—" "Hush now," Penhaligon interrupted softly, raising a hand. "That's done. In the past. What matters is what you do with the lesson. What happens next?" He looked at the young man, his pale blue eyes full of a wisdom that seemed as old as the hills. "Let me give you a piece of advice my first mentor, an old sergeant who'd worked on Spitfires, gave me 60 years ago." He leaned in a little, his voice dropping conspiratorially. He told me, "Lad, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Try to use them in that proportion. It's the best advice I ever got." He straightened up. "The machines, the people, the world around you, they're all talking all the time. The trick is to be quiet enough and humble enough to hear them." With that, he gave Vance a simple, final nod and turned to walk back to the bar to join McLeod. He didn't wait for a thank you or a response. The lesson had been delivered. It was up to the recipient to decide its worth. Hugo Vance sat alone in the corner of the pub, the murmur of conversation and the clink of glasses fading into the background. He looked at the pint in front of him, an unsolicited, undeserved gift of grace. Slowly he reached out, his hand steady, and raised the glass. The story of the Kestrel's return was already legend at RAF Marham, a tale told to every new engineer who walked onto the flight line. But for the young man in the corner of the pub, humbled and broken, it was something more. It was the beginning of wisdom. In a world that's constantly shouting, it's easy to believe that the most valuable voices are the loudest. We're taught to look for expertise in a certificate, authority in a title, and confidence in a sharp suit. We build our careers and our lives around what looks good on paper. But every now and then, a story like Arthur Penhaligon's comes along to remind us of a deeper, quieter truth. That true mastery isn't loud. It's observant. It isn't found in a manual but in the memory of weathered hands.
It doesn't lecture, it listens. The most profound lesson from the silence of Titan III isn't just about respecting our elders or the pitfalls of arrogance. It's about the humility required to learn. It's the understanding that sometimes the most complex problems have the simplest solutions, but they are visible only to those who are quiet enough to notice them. Whether it's a phantom fault in a machine, a hidden struggle in a friend, or a flaw in our own character, the answer is rarely found in shouting our own knowledge. It's found in the patient, respectful act of listening to the whispers that others are too busy to hear. It's a reminder that the most important lessons often come from the most unassuming teachers, and that a moment of grace, like a pint offered in a quiet country pub, can be more powerful than any official commendation. Stories like Arthur's are all around us, often hidden in plain sight. If you believe, as we do, that these quiet heroes deserve a voice, then please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales that honor the legacies of the truly great. Thank you for spending your time with us.